Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of the Happier Active podcast. My name's Ellie, and this week I'm talking to Maria from Sex Off the Pedestal. She's a sex and intimacy therapist, and it was a really great conversation. We covered lots of areas on this topic, and in particular in the second half, and we talked a lot about sex and intimacy for new parents and conversations that you can have during pregnancy to help with that transition, and ways you can prepare, and things that you can do to help make that time easier, and strategies for how to keep your intimate life going, which will eventually translate to your sex life when everyone's ready. So I think it's a really great episode to listen to if you're pregnant or recently postpartum. And I definitely recommend sending it on to anyone you know, just because I think it's a great starting point for that. If this is an area that you're interested in or that you've had struggles with, I definitely really recommend Maria's Instagram, which is Sex Off the Pedestal, and there's links to it in the show notes because she has loads of really great resources on there. And this is definitely a topic that I know a lot of people that I work with struggle with a bit. So it's really useful. And I can't wait for you to hear it. And as ever, if you have any feedback, questions, comments, I'd love to hear them. And if there's anyone you think would be a great fit to be on here, or any particular topics you'd like to be covered, I would love to hear about it. And I hope you enjoy the episode. Thank you.
So there are many ways to find your path to better health and happiness, and what works is highly individualised. My philosophy is that most people are more likely to find that if they're active participants in their own journey. So this is a space to start exploring some of the rich and varied areas in which people practice, so you can start thinking about what resonates with you and discover new or different practices to deepen or even start your own health practices. And today we have Maria from Sex Off the Pedestal. So why don't you start by telling us what you do?
Hey, thanks for having me. Yeah, for sure. So my name's Maria. The handle on like the socials are all Sex Off the Pedestal. I actually run a psychotherapy practice in Canada. I'm a psychotherapist first by trade and a sex therapist as well. So my specializations have always been trauma and sex, and lots of couples work in and of like all that stuff. And yeah, I work with couples, I work with individuals. I've dealt with pretty much anyone from the age of like 5 on when it comes to either trauma, psychotherapy,
how did you get into the
or
kind of
even sex?
that?
How did I do this? Well, I always tell the story that most of us that are therapists because we've struggled with our own stuff when we were younger. I don't think you become a therapist if you're incredibly healthy when you're a child, but that's more of like an inside psychotherapy joke. So I've always loved reaching out to people. I've always loved being available for people to engage in their truest and most authentic self. I believe very much that we have these ideals or ideas put on us as we grow up. And then when we evolve as humans, we start realizing that we are our own person, we are our own identity. And sometimes that takes work to get there. And one of the best parts of my job is seeing people kind of become their actual authentic selves, and whether that be in their own identity, in their sexual relationships, or even just as couples. I love seeing people really reconnect their fragmented selves and become one. So yeah, that's what I love to do. And so sex therapy has always been kind of a thing that I've done, especially with couples. I'm working with couples since the beginning of my career, and then just evolving into more and more training about intimacy and sex and relationships, connectedness, all of that stuff that is a very important part in couples.
Yeah, I think it's great. And I know from experience that a lot of people struggle to talk about that. And sometimes when I'm working with people, it'll take them a long time for that to even come up, even though as soon as they've said it, it's often actually a hugely important part of what they want to work on, or it's causing a huge amount of their stress. But they just feel like either embarrassed or shame around talking about it.
Yeah, I think it's always been this really oddly taboo topic, right? When you bring up sex, there's that kind of inertia that happens that like it's dirty or it's bad or it's sinful or all that stuff that comes around so many different ideologies, which is actually why I use the phrase sex off the pedestal very often with my clients, which is why I decided to use it as kind of like my brand, let's call it, because I do really believe in bringing sex to a level of the same as doing the dishes. Like I don't, I really want people to understand that talking about your sexuality, talking about your desires, needs, and wants, and your own sex life, and just sex in general, or your body.
Yeah, and I think it can be really difficult, like in long-term relationships, I guess, where people have fallen into patterns and they don't necessarily know how to start the conversation because they're worried about hurting their partner or making them feel bad. And so I can see that having like a space with someone else to help navigate that is probably quite helpful for a lot of people.
Yeah, I often call myself a translator, if I'm honest, like with my couples, because especially in long-term relationships, it's like we lose the ability to really listen to our partner, or we feel like we've heard the same thing over and over again. And so then there's no understanding. So when I have a couple in front of me, I'm able to say, hey, I think they're saying this, but they're using these words, but maybe we can
Oh,
understand
that's
it
so
this way. And
interesting.
all of a sudden, there's that moment of like, oh, that's what you've been trying to tell me, right? Because I'm able to use a different voice, a different form of vocabulary, and the person doesn't have any resentment towards me or anger towards me. I'm not the
Yeah.
one that left the towel on the floor, right? There's all those little things that get into in between communication. And so all of a sudden they're able to hear it and go, oh, now I understand, or now I can accept this. Let's work on this together. So there is a lot of therapy that becomes translation or mediation between two people that are just, that have so much stuff in between them that I'm able to come in and say, let's take that out for a second. Let's actually communicate.
I think about like where there's situations where people are trying to say things about hurting the other person. This thing that we've always done, I don't actually really like, or I want to try this new thing, and how to start those conversations. I think that's quite interesting.
So, what I've noticed in people is that that's our own insecurity. So, my insecurity of hurting my partner is my own, and most partners on the other side are actually incredibly appreciative of that feedback, because none of us want
Yeah.
to be doing something for or with our partner that the other person doesn't enjoy, right? It's like making them
Yeah.
the same meal every day and they actually hate mac and cheese, right? If you tell me that, then I'll start making something different, and I appreciate that feedback. I think the other kind of caveat I would say to that is that if you're going to address your partner with something that you're not enjoying, you don't like, or you need a change in, I would always bring it back to this is how I feel, this is what I want, or this is what I need, not in a blaming voice of you're doing this wrong. Because that's where we get into conflict, right? If I'm telling my partner, hey, you really suck at X, Y, and
Yeah.
Z, especially sexually, that's going to hurt. That's an attack, right? That's not a hug. That's not something that shows love. So if you turn that around and say, hey, my body doesn't feel as aroused, or my body doesn't feel as safe when we do this, can we maybe change it or have a conversation? Then there's a level of dialogue, right? There's a level of, let's talk about this in a collaborative way instead of, I'm going to attack you and now you're going to feel really bad about yourself.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And then when people have never talked about this stuff, where do you recommend they start?
I love it because there's so many of my couples that have never talked about sex to each other, and then they
Yeah.
show up in my office, and all of a sudden they're talking to a stranger about it, which I find so fascinating, right? Like they've never talked about it to themselves, and here I am asking about their wildest fantasy, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, what am I supposed to do?" This random stranger, basically, right? At the end of the day, that is what I am to them, is asking me all these wild questions, and I have no idea how to talk about it. I would say always start slow, right? I think one of the biggest things that we're also seeing in a shift, especially in sex therapy or even just in like, let's say, the pop culture idea of sex, right? So when you see all the books coming out and stuff, we're shifting away from talking about sex and we're coming into an idea of talking about pleasure, okay? So I think taking again sex off that pedestal and taking away the power that sex can have, we start talking about pleasure, and all of a sudden it's about how are we enjoying life? How are we enjoying our bodies? How are we enjoying connecting? What are we enjoying about pleasure and intimacy? Not when is the next time we're going to have penetrative sex, right? Because that sudden is like all our guards go up, we become insecure, we get scared, the anxiety starts to rise, and then the conversation goes the wrong way, right? But if I'm asking my partner, hey, what do you find pleasurable? That's a very different question than, hey, do you enjoy this sex position? If it's not something that you
Yeah.
talk about on a regular basis, right? But you do have to unfortunately start somewhere. But it's not abnormal for couples that have been together for years, that have had sex many times, that may have even children in their lives, and yet have never actually talked to their partner about fantasies, positions, what they enjoy, what they don't enjoy. And I always find that so, I actually find it sometimes heartbreaking that you can live your life with this partner and technically they know every part of you, and yet they don't know this really giant part of your identity that is your sexual identity.
I would imagine for some people, even knowing what their fantasies are is actually quite hard to access because there's so much shame often around that sort of thing, especially if you feel like what you're thinking might be weird or abnormal. And so then I suspect there's probably a tendency to lock that part of yourself away. So even answering those questions can probably be quite hard.
Of course. I mean, even like look at it in in our like normal everyday, when someone asks you what's your favorite movie. If you have a movie that's maybe too childish or goofy or maybe too spicy, you feel shame of even telling that person, hey, this is my favorite movie. So imagine our fantasies that are usually the most loss of inhibition and wild part of ourselves, sharing that with someone and then going, but will you accept this part of me, right? If I share this very vulnerable fantasy that I have, will you look at me different? Will you accept who I am?
Yeah, and I can see that that's really scary, especially if you've not spoken about it. And actually something like, I'm in Florida and there's a lot of people here who have had, and I think it's quite common all over the world, but who haven't had great sex education, where there's a lot of like religious shaming around sex and sexuality. And so then it's almost something, especially for women, that they don't even want to acknowledge that they have. It's sort of reproductive and or for male pleasure, but not very much about women's pleasure, or they haven't given much thought to their own sexuality outside of their husbands.
Yeah, unfortunately the sexual history that we have as a society, right, especially I would say in the south of the United States, but also it's prevalent here in Canada as well as it is in other forms of country, because at the end of the day it does go to our maybe more religious parts of our upbringings. There is a lot of shame that comes around sex, right? We're told very weird and difficult messages that, of course, then make us see our body as something shameful, our mind as something that is not healthy, right? And toxic, because how could you have those thoughts, right? Or how could you feel that in your body? And then we grow up thinking that, well, I'm going to keep these things to myself because someone's going to tell me I'm wrong, or someone's going to shame me, or the worst case of it could be I could go to hell for this, right? And that's terrifying.
So I work a lot with new mums, and one of the things, how it often comes up is when, as their kids get older and they start asking about body parts, and then they suddenly realize how uncomfortable they are saying the word penis or vagina. And I guess a lot of people know now that anatomical correct descriptions are sort of scientifically backed as being, you know, safer and better for children. But it's also, if they've never used those words, they can't say them without laughing, or they find it really difficult. And so it's almost, even before you're even getting to kind of intimacy stuff, just even saying the word vagina out loud can be quite difficult for a lot of people.
So many people. The one thing that I love to do in my sessions is when people do come in, because they know they're coming in for sex therapy, right? So we know we're all on the same page. I'm very aware this is what we're going to talk about. And yet I do have people that go around like 1,000 different words that they're using. And so I lead by saying them myself so that people feel more comfortable. And you see that kind of like relief that comes of like, oh, okay, we're allowed to say this word, which is so interesting that the biological anatomical word of penis, vulva, or vagina is so uncomfortable for people to say out loud. We all have it. We all know we have those things, right? And yet it's difficult. And for parents, it is also, unfortunately, I think we're in that that trend right now of parents having to reparent themselves while parenting their children, right? So if I'm a parent telling my kid I have to now talk about these things while also educating myself on it and being okay with that shame and then parenting them because I don't want them to feel this way, it's so much pressure on today's parents because they are having that kind of dual struggle of.
Yeah, and you can see that with some people that they kind of know that, but they don't know how to start making those changes because it's so difficult. Yeah.
It's very difficult. Yeah. But learning with your children is also beautiful, right? Sitting down and saying, hey, mommy's uncomfortable with this too. Let's learn together. Let's say these words out loud together. Let's learn what that looks like and what that feels like for both of us because mommy didn't have this opportunity before, right? Or daddy never talked about these things with his mommy and daddy. How do we talk about it together as a family? And it's okay to tell your kids that you don't know, right? Yeah, I remember sitting with my mom on the bed. I was young, and she opened a book on biology, and it just had female body, male body just there, and then she just explained it to me, and then we went about our day. I was like, what is this? Like, what am I supposed to do with this information, right? You don't know. And as a child, you feel lost,
No.
but I don't think we can hold it against our parents for not knowing. I think we just can learn from that experience and say, I think we know more now, and hopefully we can be brave enough to have these conversations.
Something that my mum always used to say, and I think about a lot as a parent now, is that when your children ask questions, you quite often have all this huge context, and so you start trying to make this huge, so they say where do babies come from when they're 4 or 5, you suddenly start thinking, oh my god, we've got to explain how the baby gets in there, but actually what they want is from a woman's tummy at that age. And then if they have follow-on questions, they can ask them and you can think about age-appropriate ways to say them. But they often, when they're asking those kind of questions, they don't want like a whole, they might say how does it get in there, and then that's a different conversation, but often they literally mean where is that baby. And we put all this context and other stuff into it, and we think, oh my god, we've got to explain everything, and actually they don't want a huge explanation.
That's true. And we also do kind of expect this like pressure of having to let's say dumb things down for children, but also just explaining it to them and then them absorbing the information that's appropriate for them and that their brains can actually absorb in that moment is fine too. And starting before your children even ask is also a great idea of just having those conversations around the house, or when you see a show, when you're watching a movie or a show with your child, and explaining it to them as you're going, because then that also allows them to feel less shame about asking these questions, right? If we want our children to come to us when they have questions or they've gotten into quote unquote some sort of sexual problem, right? Or they are feeling something different in their body, we need to be able to facilitate that on a daily basis where they feel safe enough to ask these questions, right? I always find it interesting when I talk to parents and they're like, she never told me she was having sex. And I'm like, well, have you ever talked about sex at home? Well, no, we don't talk about it. I'm like, well, then how do you expect her to talk about it then? Like, if you've never brought it up, why would she think it's safe to bring it up, right? We have to create that as parents, that safe space of sex is normal, our bodies are normal, all of these words are normal. We don't need to be using any shame or fear around them, so that then when they do get older, they do come to us when it's necessary and we can help them along.
So now that teenagers especially have access to all this information, a lot of which is wrong, you want to make sure they've got safe spaces to talk about it. And actually something that I've said to some people, if you're really uncomfortable, you're going to know that they're not going to want to talk to you about it. If you've got close family friends or aunties and uncles who they could have that conversation with, where it's one step removed, it's not as embarrassing because it's not mum, but it's still an adult who can give you feedback, and it's still in a sort of environment where you're getting the feedback, but it's less
Scary. Yeah, I think one of the beautiful things about our, like let's say the millennial parents, because I think those are usually like what we're looking at in terms of generation, they're also very positive when it comes to therapy. And so what I've noticed is a huge increase in children's therapy just for someone to talk to. So it's not based off of like any diagnoses or any like troubles at school. It's more just parents noticing, hey, I didn't have somebody to talk to when I was younger, and I really could have benefited from therapy. I'm just going to put my kid in once a month just so they have a touch point. They have someone that they could maybe talk to if they needed to. And then we always know that there's kind of that safety net if necessary. And I've loved seeing that. I think the other reminder is they're also feeding off of our energy. If they come to us with something and we immediately get uncomfortable, ashamed, embarrassed, like
Yeah.
fidgety or things like that, then it's not a safe place for them. They feed that. They
Yeah.
know that. They know when they're going to quote unquote get in trouble because that's how they interpret it, right? So it's also on us as parents to educate ourselves enough and to become comfortable with very uncomfortable
And at the
conversations.
beginning, you were talking about trauma and how that kind of feeds into all of this, which I think is really interesting because a lot of people maybe don't address that. And so it can be very historic. And again, I was just interested in how, or what recommendations you have for people when they have those traumas that they've never addressed, but they want to start.
Ooh, that's probably one of the scariest things to do, right? I think even scarier than just talking about sex. A trauma is a tricky thing. I'm a firm believer that our body and our mind tells us when we're ready to address our trauma, especially when it comes to childhood or adolescent trauma. So in my practice, what I call it is kind of we have doors in our brain. A lot of them are trauma doors, and there's going to be a moment where your body and your brain go, okay, it's time. And they open that door for you. I will say, in my experience, once a trauma door is open, it's open, and we have to deal with it, or it can get pretty ugly. So, addressing that and knowing, like, okay, it's time, this trauma door has opened for me is really important, especially when it comes to any sexual trauma. I think that the urgency and the importance to actually go through that and go what I would call go through the mud of that is very important for you just in your own internal identity and your own internal healing. I won't lie though, it's one of the most painful experiences you can go through. And I say that to my clients all the time. I always warn them. I'm like, okay, this trauma door is open. We're going to clean out this closet. It's going to be one of the hardest things you've done in your life. We have to be okay with the pain because it is painful, right? But it's also such a beautiful experience that at the other side, there is so much beauty and light that can come from it. But we can't get there until we get through all this because a lot of people are like, how do I get over my trauma? It's like, oh, it's the typical, we're not getting over it. I'm leading you right through it. And we're going to pick it apart and we're going to break it down. And hopefully on the other side, you see the reason why I did this, right? But therapy's uncomfortable and that's okay, but it's going to be painful. And some people decide to just kind of leave the door half open until they're ready, and that's okay. You can't force it. There's no way you can force.
I guess that's something that then the person who you're doing it with is so important because it's so difficult. And so what recommendations would you have for people when they're trying to choose who to work with?
I love that question. So finding a therapist is like finding a relationship, right? So do not be afraid of interviewing different therapists. So doing phone consultations, going to an intake session, and just kind of getting a feel for that relationship. It's an investment. And yes, therapy can be a barrier when it comes to finances, but there are a lot of options out there. I would always recommend if your therapist is not making you feel safe or comfortable, in the sense of comfortable as in like I trust this person, not comfortable in that she's not leading me down uncomfortable roads, because a good therapist will do that. But if you're feeling that safety and that trust with your therapist, then it's probably a good fit. The one thing I always tell my clients is don't be afraid to fire your therapist. Don't be afraid to fire me, because this isn't about me. This is not my journey. This is your journey. So you need to find the best person to go on that journey with. So doing those interviews, trying different things, and realistically never giving up until you find that person. It could take a long time, but if you really want that healing, you need to find the right fit for you. So trying to do the research on their education, their experience, the type of therapies they offer, whether it's in person or online. Like all those things play into how you're going to heal in your journey.
Sometimes you can't exactly put your finger on why it's not quite right, but it's almost like dating. Like sometimes there's just like a vibe on paper, it all looks fine, and then you talk to them and just something like energetically doesn't quite connect, and then you're probably not going to be able to do that difficult work, are you, if you don't have that click?
No, of course not. If you're feeling uncomfortable and you don't click, then of course you're not going to trust it, right? You're not going to actually give all of yourself to that healing journey. So then all of a sudden you're wasting time, energy, and money on something that's not working for you. So it's okay to say, hey, this isn't working. I need to try somebody new. But you're right, it is sometimes a feeling, right? It is that quote unquote vibe that you get from someone. If the energy's not right,
Yeah.
we're just wasting our time. And a good therapist will recognize that. I think that's also really important. A good therapist will say, I actually don't think we're right for each other. I'd like to pass you on to this person who I think could do incredible work with you. And again, I've been a therapist for more than 10 years. I have done that many times. And I've had clients go, no, 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 I think we're good. I'm like, no, I know we're not. And I need you to trust me that I'm not the right therapist for you. I want to find the right therapist for you because it's not worth you spending a year doing therapy and not achieving that healing.
I've had quite a lot of therapy, and I find sometimes like one person can really help you with one thing and it's really moves you forward, but then once you've dealt with that one thing, you almost need to find someone else for like either a fresh pair of eyes, or because you've kind of got into a pattern of comfortability with that person, and then you almost need a bit of discomfort to kickstart moving forward.
Exactly. And a lot of us are specialists in our area, and it doesn't mean that we can do everything and all of it, right? I know that, like, for example, for myself, I know I'm an exceptional therapist when it comes to sex and intimacy. I don't do well with depression. I'm not a great therapist for that. Can I do it? Sure. I was trained in it. I have the education and experience. Do I think that I can give 100% service and like healing and journey to my clients? No, which is why I'll say, hey, I've got an exceptional therapist that is trained and knows this intimately. That's your person, right? It's an important thing to also acknowledge as a therapist the things that we're not good at, because we can't be. We cannot be excellent at every single thing.
I think it's something that people struggle with a bit because they'll suddenly think, right, I need therapy, and they'll just go for the first thing, or they don't look at the different types of things they could be doing. And that kind of meshes with what I was saying in my introduction about finding the different niches that work for you. And like EMDR might work for some people but not others, and talking about something, you know, for some people with trauma, talking about it isn't actually that helpful. For other people, they have to talk about it loads to sort of get it out. And so finding those different
I think I would also add that we have this beautiful thing called the internet, right? And now we have artificial intelligence. So even like, I know there's lots of people that Google things, but you could also put in a prompt of, these are my symptoms, this is what I'm feeling, this is the type of therapy I think I'm looking for. What's out there? And then it can give you a list of things, like you said, like, hey, for this, EMDR would probably be a great idea. Somatic therapy would be good for this. Or you should probably look for a therapist that has experience and education in narrative therapy or working with your inner child. Whatever that may be, we have the resources to ask those questions. And I'm not saying it's not going to be accurate every time. Obviously, we all know that there are flaws in that. But it can lead us in a direction when you're feeling stuck of, I don't know what to do or I don't know who to ask. We can put in a prompt that says, hey, help me out at least navigating in the right direction, so that at least I know what types of therapists I should be looking at.
And then the other thing that I just wanted to briefly talk about was, like I said, I work with a lot of new parents, and I guess something that comes up when people have recently had a baby is like dynamics often, and there can often be like a big power shift in the relationship, and problems that hadn't been problems before pop up. So I was just wondering if you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah, I love that. It's a huge issue, let's call it, that isn't talked about enough, especially when we're going through the baby phase, right? So we get pregnant, everything's about the baby showers, the gifts, the this, the that. Then there's pregnancy, labor, all the self-care stuff that comes with that. But then we often forget about the relationship, right? Because it's not central anymore, which means we forget to talk to each other, which means we start losing that connection. We stop being a team. And we have to recognize that we went from being romantic partners that had time, effort, energy for each other to now being co-parents, which is a fully different role that nobody really knows what or how to do until you're in it, right? We could have 1,000 parenting courses and you could go to 1,000 workshops before becoming a parent, but you don't really know until you are a parent what that really feels like and what it does to you individually, right? So my biggest recommendation for couples that are about to have a baby is when we're in the pregnancy stage, we have to talk about the relationship and what it looks like to still be a priority for each other and taking care of each other while still knowing that the baby's going to come first, right? But what does that look like? And basically having what I would call little business meetings of how are we still taking care of the relationship? How do we still take care of each other? And where does, in the instance of intimacy and sex, where does that fall for us? So we know that especially for pregnancy, for women, for vulva owners, I would say, sex can be either something we want all the time, every day when we're pregnant, or something that is completely repulsive, and it can be anything in between when a woman's going through pregnancy. So having those open conversations are going to be important. It's also going to be very important that as the person that's carrying the baby communicates to the partner what their boundaries and what they are quote unquote allowed and not allowed to do during that time. I do find that a lot of couples that I see post pregnancy is the fact that their expectations were very different, the boundaries were very different, and now we're dealing with betrayal or pain, right? So just as simple as, is your partner allowed to engage more in self-pleasure using external stimuli, or are they not? Is this a conversation we need to have? What does that look like, right? And again, allowing that open conversation, which can be incredibly uncomfortable for most people, but very necessary. And again, that recommendation of if you feel uncomfortable talking about it with your partner, then bring in a therapist that can help you. Therapy is not about your relationship's about to fall apart and we're at the brink of divorce. Therapy is also maintenance. And it is that kind of third person check-in of, hey, we're having this struggle. We want to make sure we're okay. Can you help us navigate this? Because realistically, I'm trained in asking you 1,000 questions that you've never thought about, but that will help your relationship. So let me do that for you. Let a therapist do that for you so that you can get to the baby phase, which then is a whole other bag of tricks of conversation, right? So our bodies are changing, our roles are changing. We're usually sleep deprived on both ends, right? We have to have these conversations about how the body is changing. I would also say one of the things that I'm fully, I wouldn't say against, maybe not okay with, let's put it in like more of a tame way, 6-week medical cycle of when you give birth and then the like go ahead for physical activity at 6 weeks, I actually find is detrimental to couples. I find that it adds level of pressure that is fully unnecessary. And I also don't think it looks at the uniqueness of every body, because not all of us will recover in 6 weeks. Not all of us are feeling ourselves in 6 weeks. And science has also shown us that most women don't actually feel themselves until 7 years after, right? It takes a long time. So that to me, that's usually my first recommendation for most new parents is we're taking that 6-week thing that doctors tell us off the table. We are not looking at that as a goal or deadline. That's gone. We need to look at what our individual bodies are going to give us and what we can handle and what we can't handle. And then I would also say I usually take sex off the table. we're ready. So I start with, again, shifting it to pleasure. What can we do during that time that gives us pleasure, that enjoys intimacy, that re engages with our new body, because it is a very new body that we're dealing with, that takes sex, penetrative sex, off the table completely until we're ready to actually engage with our body. And the more controversial part, especially for I think your listeners probably down south,
Yeah.
would be the solo sex that we can have with ourselves. So I very highly recommend that after giving birth, as a woman, reigniting that sexual identity is very important. So looking at your own body, exploring it, getting acquainted with all the changes, and being comfortable with that is going to be way more important.
I really agree about the 6 week thing, because it often puts like huge pressure on women to be like, oh, well, I should be fine now. I definitely should be back at it. In loads of ways, not just sexually, actually, like exercise also. But and again, because so many changes have happened, often it's quite painful for women at the beginning, and that solo exploration will help them be able to explain to their partner, this has changed, it's actually this that I used to like hurts now, or I need to go and see a pelvic health physio to try and help move some scar tissue, or all those kind of things, and then they can give the information to their partner for what is going to slowly ease that back in.
Exactly. And educating our partner, for example, if you choose to go down the route of breastfeeding, your breasts become not your own anymore, right? They're now your child. They're not sexual during that time at all. And so what was a sexual organ before for your partner that they may have been very attracted to, and you may have been as well, shifts. So we have to educate our partner of, hey, I'm actually going to wear a bra or something to cover the, because I actually prefer you not touching there, because that to me has lost its sexual connection right now. And then allowing that, right? Allowing that respect and that mutual respect to happen
Yeah.
between the two of you. And then also having a conversation, because your partner also lost that too, right? So we have to respect the fact that our partner is also now dealing with a new body. And so having that conversation, hey, how do you feel about me having to wear a bra now and not allowing any upper body touch? What can we do for you that will also help that? Because we are both changing and we both have to adapt.
And that's so difficult for a lot of people, I think. And it's because, like you say, like a lot of the education around that feels like, oh, 6 weeks, everything's back to normal, off we go. And often I try and reframe that to people as like, that's when your major wounds have gone. So like the wound where your placenta detached has gone. The stitches might have come out, but now that's is now going to start. So doing loads of core work to try and help those poor muscles that have been all stretched out and had this horrible 9 months. We're going to like try and help them to heal. And your vagina has probably had a pretty rough few months, so we've got to try and help that do some stuff to feel better and heal.
Exactly. And that's
Yes.
assuming that your labor and delivery wasn't traumatic for you, right? That's also assuming that you actually came out of that experience mentally and emotionally okay, right? Because that's just our physical self. You're right. It's the major wound. Yeah, technically after 6 weeks, let's say on like a statistic level, on average, yeah, most women are healed and ready to go, whatever that means, right? But there's so much more to pregnancy, to labor and delivery. And then there's the emotional baggage that usually comes in through my door of whether or not our caregiving partner was actually there emotionally for them during pregnancy, labor, and delivery. Because that's going to play a huge part on whether or not the parent that gave birth is still feeling emotionally connected to that partner, because co-parenting is very different than being in a relationship without a child. That's going to shift. And so if the birth parent doesn't feel supported, loved, cared for, sex is the furthest thing from their mind. And now we need to reconnect that connection that broke because the caregiving parent, right, wasn't there because they were also uneducated, unfortunately. There's a lot of ignorance that goes around these things, which we need to do more education on for both parties.
Yeah, and I actually think something, I imagine you see this as well, that a lot of people who have had still have a lot of trauma from it, because even if it is straightforward, it's often the most painful, difficult period of your life. Sometimes even for a straightforward birth can still be 3 days. And then people feel almost embarrassed to be so traumatized from it when their notes say completely standard, hardly needed any, and then they've got friends who seem to be recovering much better, who've had to have, emergency C-sections or episiotomies and these huge dramas, and they almost feel like they can't talk about that trauma because it was straightforward.
You know what this is going to sound kind of like a bit of a morbid example or connection, but go with me. I usually compare it to being in a car accident. Some of us can be in a car accident and walk away and be fine, while others can be in a car accident and it can actually really affect their mental health, right? Because it's a internalized trauma. So our body goes through perhaps the same trauma as two different individuals, but it doesn't mean that our body is going to absorb it the same way. So it's the same with birth and delivery, right? So if I'm going through labor and delivery, and yes, the doctors are saying it all went standard, it all worked out the way that it was supposed to on paper, that doesn't mean my body absorbed it that way, because my body is not a medical professional. It's just the way my body is built, and the layers that I have as a human in my own identity, in my own past, that are going to tell me whether or not this was safe for me or not, right? So there's all the internal stuff that's happening to a person that most of the time we don't take into account that needs to be. So again, many of my couples come in and I've got the one partner saying, the birth was great, she was fantastic, she was strong, the doctor said it was great, our baby's healthy, and yet she's a mess. And I'm like, that's because we have no idea what happened to her. Nobody asked her what happened inside.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I find a lot of women who are dealing with huge overwhelm in postpartum, when they come to me, they were very shocked by how much care they got in pregnancy, being constantly asked how they are, and then the minute the baby's out, even the medical professionals who were very concerned about them before, suddenly very little interest. So then they really feel, I think, like a loss of connection with themselves, and so then it's hard to make a connection with your partner if you're not even connected to yourself.
I think one of the biggest misconceptions about having a child is how much loss you actually go through. I don't think, unfortunately, and I mean, obviously nobody wants to think about grief during labor and delivery, but there's grief. You lose part of yourself as a parent. You lose that freedom, the individuality. You become something else. Your partner loses things, you lose things, right? And the focus does become about the child, which is also what I've loved seeing, the growth in having postpartum doulas, like helping the parent, but then also the growth that there is now. I don't know if you guys have had them, but there's a few in the UK that I know of, and here in Canada they're becoming a bit more popular. The postpartum hotels where you go as a new mom and you live in a hotel where they actually take care of you for a few days. So they bring you food. It's like a spa. It's a spa for and again, like very privileged idea if you have the ability to do this, but it's a beautiful concept of we're taking care of the mom, the birth parent, that can go and stay in these places and still feel that connectedness and still feel taken care of. Because I do think, like you just said, many more people are realizing, hey, we never actually think about the mom after this.
Yeah, and it's often mum in relation to the baby. So the postpartum depression is often being treated because it might affect the child. It's not really about... It's even in those things that are about mum, they're often actually mum in relation to the baby.
Yes, in how you are as a parent, not how you are as an individual.
If you're breastfeeding because you're keeping the child alive, but then I think it's hard. It can be hard for people to then step out of that after that kind of initial 6 week, 3 months. I like to think of it as that like fourth trimester. So that first 3 months after that is when some of that stuff you can start thinking about a bit more. But it's so hard.
So that brings up a very interesting story. So friends of ours just had a new baby. And I said to her, I'm like, okay, I'm going to show up on the first couple days. I'm going to bring you meals. I'm like, but in 6 weeks, I'll be here to help you
Yeah.
with your laundry and stuff. She's like, why 6 weeks? I'm like, because everybody will show up the first couple weeks and then you'll be alone. And she's like, no. I'm like, no, yeah. Everyone's gonna want to come see the baby in the first couple weeks, and they will all shower you with flowers and chocolates and all that stuff. And in 6 weeks from now, when you're in the trenches and you're alone and you're crying and you haven't showered in 3 days, that's when you'll see me. And she's like, are you just disappearing? I'm like, I'm not gonna disappear from you. I just want you to know why I'm not showing up today. Well,
Sleeping in
first of
its
all,
own
you're like,
bed.
oh my God, I hit the lottery. This baby's amazing. They're sleeping all the time. Yeah, I can shower. I don't know what everyone was talking about. And then it
I
hits you.
think the other thing that I just, before we finish, just wanted to briefly touch on is for
Mhm.
men or the non-birthing partner.
Yeah.
Although I have to say, like, when I deal with
Hmm.
LGBT couples, it does tend to be less because there
Hmm.
tends to be better communication around a lot of this stuff to start with.
I'm laughing because you're right. There is better communication because they're used to having better communication. They already have it. There's no assumed norms, so they have to communicate.
With so men generally, they find that postpartum bit quite identity shifting and often
Yeah.
quite difficult because they often don't know what their role
Hmm.
is. And so I think there's almost for them this idea that, oh, in the 6 weeks or the 3 months or whatever it is, everything's going to go back to normal, but there'll be a baby there. And I think that can be quite difficult because they often don't know how to
Yeah.
talk about that without it sounding like they don't love the baby or they're, you know. And so that can add to the barriers, I think.
Yeah, I love that you bring that up because it's true. It's the unfortunate fact that most men, if we want to generalize in like the more heterosexual relationships, get forgotten in this process, right? And you're right, they're lost. They don't know what is my role here, what am I supposed to do? My biggest recommendation is always, or the way that I see it is mom's responsibility is to take care of the baby. Your responsibility is to take care of mom. That is your role. Right now, your role is to make sure she is showered, she is taken care of, she has water in her water bottle, she is well fed. If she needs a break, you give it to her. Your role is to take care of her, and that is it, nothing else. And it's interesting when you give that directive how many men are like, oh, this makes sense to me now. But we're not taught that, right? So, again, another recommendation is I always say take the time off work if you can do it. Make sure you're taking care of your wife or the mom, whatever the dynamic might be. And your energy is only going into that. So you're right now, in a way, yes, a butler, right? You are there to take care and like make sure the house is clean or whatever her need is in this moment. If you don't want to feel lost in this relationship and you still want to feel connected and you still want to make sure that your part, because I always say this, you want to make
Mm-hmm.
sure your partner wants to have sex with you at the end of all of this, you show up then. Because the more you disappear, the less you're going to have sex and the more you're going to end up in my office. So your role right now is to take care of your partner.
Yeah, and I guess that probably really helps with that emotional intimacy, which is much less likely to then lead to the sexual intimacy distance if you're keeping that emotional intimacy there.
Of course, you can't go from 0 to 60 without the emotional connection. So if you, and I mean, imagine yourself, right? You're sitting there, you're the new mom, you're holding this baby, and you've got a partner that's bringing you food, taking care of your, like your water bottle, right? Making sure you're hydrated, making sure you've got the right pillows. You have a heat pad on your back, making sure and also setting the right boundaries of who's allowed in the house and who's not allowed in the house, who's allowed to call and ask questions and who's not allowed to call and ask questions. When are those times? All of those things, having fresh sheets, making your bath with the Epsom salt so that you heal. I always tell them like this is going to lead to better intimacy, both emotional and physical. If you choose to be on your phone and your partner is sitting there with no water in her water bottle, I will guarantee you that it will take twice as long to have sex.
Maybe even longer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But they need to know that, right? Again, it's the education piece because we don't have these conversations with our children, right? We didn't have these conversations. I'm sure if you ask your like the counterparts of the people that you work with, the males, did their father tell them this? No. Nobody told them this. So they need to be educated, just like we need to be educated on how to take care of our children. And they need to then be educated on how to take care of our children, but they also need to be educated on what does pregnancy, labor, delivery
Yeah.
look like, what does postpartum look like, and what's my role
Yeah, and I
here.
also think, I mean, this is again a massive generalization, but I think in general, like my husband, we did a pre-labor course, and one of the handouts they had, which he loved, was like a list of things you're in charge of, because he liked to have an actual, it's like a visual thing that's like, these are the things that I am doing to tick off. And like he wouldn't have known to do some of that, he might have done instinctively, but it was like the emotional security of having like a checklist.
A to-do list, something tangible that they can actually think about, right? I will say I'm one of the people in my friend group that's kind of the, let's say, the crazy one, that I actually text the husbands before the baby's born. I'm like, these are your roles. Just in case if you knew and I'm offending you, that's okay. I'd rather offend you than like let my friend have a baby and
Yeah.
you have no idea. Because I'm also trying to prevent them from ending up in therapy, right? Or in a divorce. Because unfortunately, after children, you can start going in that direction if you're not doing the right things for each other, right? So I am that person that sends out that handout of like, hey, just so you know, she's gonna need water, a lot of it. Please have that ready for her, right? And it's helpful. And I've had like a number of my friends reach out and say that they were very grateful, both parties. And obviously, there's always the ones like, I know what I'm doing. I'm like, I don't know you do. And it's okay to say you don't, right? It's okay to say I have no clue what I'm doing, because at the end of the day, none of us
I think about
actually
this a
do.
lot, but it's actually very hard to prepare for. And because, and I guess especially from like a sexual and intimacy point of view, because you don't know how it's going to change you until it happens. You can anticipate some things, but it's until the dust has settled a bit, you don't fully know how you're going to feel differently. And so then that reconnection becomes really important, because you're almost having to relearn the new person that they've become.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think with that comes accepting that we don't know until after, right? Because I know most of us, before having children, have made the terrible assumption of, I'm going to be fine, I'm going to lose the baby weight, I'm going to be working out by 6 weeks, I'm going to be a great parent, I'm never going to let my child look at a screen, right? We've all done that wonderful thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, my child is going to be like, yeah, of course, right? We all think that before we have it. I think that's the
Mm-hmm.
part where I find that our egos and our arrogance get in the way. And I think we all need to stay a step back and say, you know what? I actually have no idea. And then communicating that to your partner of like, I don't know how I'm going to feel about you sexually when we're done. Can we take this off? Can we just put the brakes on? Can we start opening this communication line and start really exploring together? Because I don't know how I'm going to feel. And I may not lose the baby weight, and I might have insecurities, or I might end up feeling more pain than I used to, right? All of those things can happen. Allowing that conversation is incredibly important, and not setting expectations that you're going to be sexually active right away or even loving your body right away.
Something I talk about a lot in a whole life perspective with people is about setting yourself up to fail, even if it's unwittingly, and how that goes into like a negative loop, where if you're setting goals that are unrealistic and then you don't meet them, it feeds into that like, oh, and it's my fault and I'm bad. That is even more complicated in sexual relationships, because then there's the shame attached and feeling like you're failing your partner and yourself. And so it quite quickly can then spiral quite badly, I guess, because people are unintentionally putting themselves into that loop.
Exactly. Yeah, creating that lie for ourselves, right? Of the one I usually use is this idea of like being right back into shape after having a child. It takes time, it takes effort, right? And you also don't know what kind of child you're going to have. There are children that, yeah, they allow you to work out once or twice a week, right? There's other ones that don't, that need you more, and you can't do that. So, but if you go in thinking, oh, I'm going to be fit by 6 months, or I'm going to work out every day, and then that doesn't happen, we start hating ourselves. We start looking down on ourselves. We start being disappointed. And that's where the grief comes in. And that's where the depression starts coming in, right? Because we've set
Yeah.
expectations that we actually had no control
Yeah,
over.
I think that's so important. I have taken up loads of your time, so thank you very much. This has been so interesting. And if people want to like learn more about this or reach out to you, what's the best thing for them to do?
Yeah, so you can either look for me on Instagram with Sex Off the Pedestal, same title if you want to do website, so sexoffthepedestal.com. You can also just search my name, Maria Orego, if you want to. Yeah, and just reach out and we can connect, and I'm happy to help with resources or with counseling and therapy. I've got a few new little books that are coming out soon, so that'll be like something to look out for that couples can do together in order to build that emotional intimacy that can lead to physical intimacy. So it's full of questions and exercises, just a fun little date night kind of activity.